Sirens wailed through cold morning air. Red and blue lights flashed against wet pavement, illuminating an expensive charcoal suit. Rain poured down relentlessly, soaking fine wool fabric. Bradley Jenkins stepped out of his patrol cruiser, a smug grin plastered across his face. He saw a black man standing beside a broken-down sedan, trying to flag down help. Instead of offering assistance, Bradley offered mockery. Laughter echoed in empty streets, harsh and cruel. Little did this arrogant policeman know, Karma possessed an incredibly sharp memory. Tomorrow morning, within quiet, mahogany-lined walls of Courtroom 4B, absolute silence would replace loud laughter. Power dynamics would violently flip. The rain was an absolute deluge, coming down in sheets that turned the desolate stretch of County Road 119 into a blinding wash of grey. It was nearing midnight on a Tuesday. David Hayes, a 48-year-old man with silver grazing his temples and a meticulously tailored Italian suit, gripped the steering wheel of his charcoal grey Lexus. He was exhausted. He had just wrapped up a grueling 14-hour day attending a legal symposium across the state and was eager to get back to his home in the suburbs of Westbridge. Suddenly, a loud, violent pop echoed from the front right side of his vehicle, followed instantly by the violent shudder of the steering column. The car jerked hard toward the muddy shoulder. Gripping the wheel with trained composure, David managed to guide the heavy luxury sedan safely off the asphalt, tires crunching into the wet gravel, just as the rim began to scrape terribly against the ground. He let out a long, heavy sigh, watching the rain batter the windshield. A blowout. Of all the nights, and of all the locations. County Road 119 was notorious for its lack of streetlights and sparse traffic. David popped the trunk, grabbed his umbrella, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The wind immediately inverted his umbrella, rendering it useless. Within seconds, his expensive suit was plastered to his skin, completely ruined. He pulled out his cell phone, hoping to call roadside assistance, only to find the screen displaying a frustrating "no service" message. He was in a dead zone. Resigned to his fate, David stood by the side of his vehicle, raising a hand whenever the rare pair of headlights appeared in the distance, hoping a good Samaritan might pull over or at least alert a tow truck further down the line. 20 minutes passed. The cold was beginning to seep into his bones. Then, salvation seemed to arrive. The distinct rhythmic flash of red and blue lights cut through the heavy curtain of rain. A Westbridge Police Department cruiser pulled up slowly behind David's crippled Lexus, its spotlight blindingly bright as it hit David's face. David shielded his eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Law enforcement. They had radios. They could call a tow. The cruiser's door opened and Officer Bradley Jenkins stepped out. Bradley was a heavy-set man in his early 30s, known around the precinct for his aggressive swagger and a disciplinary record that was entirely too thick for someone with only 6 years on the force. He adjusted his utility belt, a dark poncho draped over his broad shoulders, and sauntered toward David with a deliberate, intimidating slowness. "Evening, officer," David called out over the roar of the storm, trying to maintain a polite, conversational tone despite the freezing rain dripping from his chin. "I had a blowout. My phone doesn't have any service out here. I'd be incredibly grateful if you could radio for a tow truck." Bradley didn't answer immediately. He stopped a few feet away, shining his heavy, metal mag light directly into David's eyes, then slowly panning the beam over David's ruined suit, down to his expensive leather shoes, and finally over the sleek, late-model Lexus. A slow, condescending smirk spread across Bradley's face. "Is that right?" Bradley drawled, his voice dripping with unmistakable skepticism. "A blowout." "Yes," David said, pointing to the shredded front right tire. "As you can see." Bradley took a step closer, invading David's personal space. The officer's eyes were cold, scanning David with a familiar, ugly prejudice that David had encountered entirely too many times in his life, despite his prestigious career. Bradley saw a black man in a high-end luxury vehicle on a dark, isolated road, and in his narrow mind, an ugly narrative was already writing itself. "Whose car is this?" Bradley demanded, the question sharp and accusatory. David blinked, the sheer audacity of the question catching him momentarily off guard. "It's my car, officer." Bradley let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. The sound was abrasive, slicing through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. "Your car, right. $100,000 vehicle, and you're just out here for a midnight joyride. Let me see your license and registration." Now, David maintained his composure. He had spent decades in courtrooms dealing with aggressive, unyielding personalities. He knew better than to match the officer's hostility, especially on a dark road with no witnesses. "Of course," David said calmly. He reached slowly toward his jacket pocket. "Hands where I can see them," Bradley snapped, his hand instantly dropping to rest on the butt of his service weapon. "Move slow. Very slow." "My wallet is in my inner breast pocket," David explained, his voice remaining level, completely devoid of panic. He slowly withdrew his leather wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it over. "The registration is in the glove compartment. May I retrieve it?" Bradley snatched the license from David's hand, shining his flashlight onto the plastic card, then back up to David's face. "David Hayes," Bradley read aloud, mispronouncing the last name slightly on purpose. "Stay right where you are, Dave. Don't move a muscle." Bradley walked over to the passenger side of the Lexus, shining his light aggressively through the windows, inspecting the interior as if searching for contraband or signs of a struggle. He took his time, intentionally leaving David standing in the freezing rain for another 10 minutes while he sat in the dry warmth of his cruiser, running the plates and the license. When Bradley finally returned, the smirk was still there, though tinged with mild annoyance that the car hadn't come back stolen. He shoved the license back into David's chest, forcing David to catch it before it fell into the mud. "Car checks out," Bradley sneered. "But you know, I've seen guys like you driving cars like this before. Usually means you're involved in something you shouldn't be. Drug running, fraud. You're awfully far from the bad side of town, aren't you?" David's jaw tightened. The blatant racism, the casual cruelty of the man, was staggering. David could have ended it right then. He could have told Officer Jenkins exactly who he was. He could have mentioned his recent appointment by the governor or his decades of prosecuting corruption cases. But David chose not to. He wanted to see exactly how this officer treated ordinary citizens when he thought no one was watching. "I'm a lawyer," David stated simply. Bradley threw his head back and laughed. The sound was genuinely amused, a deep, belly laugh of pure mockery. "A lawyer? Oh, that's rich. Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States. Listen to me, lawyer." Bradley stepped in close, jabbing a thick finger into David's chest. "You're lucky I don't tow this piece of junk and leave you out here to walk. In fact, you're parked illegally. This shoulder is for emergency stops only." "A blown tire is an emergency stop, officer," David pointed out quietly. "Not in my jurisdiction, it ain't," Bradley shot back. He pulled out his citation book and hastily scribbled a ticket, the rain smudging the ink. He ripped the yellow copy out and slapped it against David's wet chest. "Citation for obstructing a public roadway. You want a tow truck? Walk a mile down the road. You might find a gas station that's open. Don't let me catch you hanging around this vehicle in an hour, or I'll arrest you for loitering." "You are leaving me stranded," David said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an authoritative weight that momentarily made Bradley pause. In freezing rain, with no cell service. Bradley recovered his cocky demeanor instantly. He leaned in, a malicious glint in his eye. Tough luck, buddy. Next time, buy a cheaper car. Maybe you can afford a spare tire. With that, Officer Bradley Jenkins turned his back, climbed into his warm cruiser, and drove away, his tires kicking up a massive spray of muddy water that splashed directly onto David's legs. David stood in the dark, watching the tail lights fade into the distance. He looked down at the soggy, illegible ticket in his hand. He didn't feel anger, not exactly. He felt a cold, sharp clarity. He folded the ruined ticket, placed it carefully into his pocket, and began the long, freezing walk toward the distant highway lights. The next morning, the Westbridge Police Department precinct was bustling with the usual hum of shift changes, ringing telephones, and the scent of stale, burned coffee. Officer Bradley Jenkins walked through the double-glass doors like he owned the building. He was out of his rain gear, dressed in a crisp, freshly pressed uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Morning, Brad," called out Simon Lewis, a fresh-faced rookie who was nervously organizing a stack of incident reports at the front desk. "Morning, rookie," Bradley replied, grabbing a styrofoam cup and pouring himself a dark brew. He took a sip and grimaced. "You make this dirt, Simon?" "Ah, yes, sir. Sorry, Officer Jenkins." Bradley chuckled, clapping the younger man hard on the shoulder. "Relax, kid. I'm just messing with you. Man, what a night shift. Pouring rain. Miserable out there. But I had some fun near the end." Simon looked up, eager to learn from the veteran. "Yeah? What happened?" Bradley leaned against the desk, crossing his arms and projecting his voice so a few other nearby officers could hear. "Caught this guy out on Route 119, pitch black, middle of nowhere. Got a busted tire on a brand new Lexus." Bradley paused for dramatic effect, shaking his head. Looked exactly like the type of guy who wouldn't know how to earn a car like that, honestly, if you catch my drift. Standing there in this fancy suit, completely helpless. Tells me he's a lawyer. A few officers nearby chuckled. "So what did you do?" Simon asked. "I wrote him a ticket for obstructing traffic and told him to walk." Bradley laughed, a cruel, self-satisfied sound. "Left him right there in the mud. You got to show these arrogant types who actually runs the streets. You give them an inch, they think they're above the law. I bet he's still out there drying off his Gucci loafers." Captain William Cole walked past, a stack of files in his hand. He paused, looking at Bradley with a stern, unamused expression. "Jenkins, you're up in Superior Court today, aren't you? The armed robbery suppression hearing." Bradley immediately stood up straighter, his cocky smile fading into a look of serious professionalism. "Yes, Captain. Case number 409. I'm the primary arresting officer. The DI needs my testimony to ensure the weapon isn't thrown out of evidence." "Don't mess it up," Captain Cole warned. "Defense attorney is Richard Davies. He's sharp. He'll try to poke holes in your probable cause for the search. If we lose that gun, the whole case goes down the drain, and the suspect walks." "Don't worry, Captain," Bradley said, patting his chest confidently. "I've got my report memorized. Davies isn't going to lay a glove on me. I know how to handle the stand." "Good. Get over to the courthouse. You're on the docket for 10 a.m. As Bradley grabbed his hat and headed toward the door, he felt invincible. This was his element. He loved testifying. He loved the feeling of power when he sat in the witness box, knowing that his words could send a man to prison for a decade. He was the law, miles away, in the hushed, deeply carpeted corridors of the Westbridge Superior Courthouse. The atmosphere was entirely different. David Hayes sat in his private chambers, surrounded by walls of legal volumes bound in rich leather. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish. A hot cup of Earl Grey tea sat on his mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the freezing misery of the night before. David looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp. He had managed to find a gas station, call a tow truck, and get home by 3 a.m. His beautiful suit was currently sitting in a trash can, completely unsalvageable. There was a soft knock on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," David said. Greg Robinson, the massive, deeply respected courtroom bailiff, stepped into the room. Greg had served in the courthouse for 20 years and knew every judge, attorney, and clerk by name. "Good morning, Your Honor. Docket looks a little heavy today. 5 pre-trial motions, 2 sentencings, and a suppression hearing." "Thank you, Greg," David replied, standing up and moving toward the tall wooden wardrobe in the corner of his office. "I'm ready for it. How is the gallery looking?" "Filling up, Your Honor. The suppression hearing has drawn some attention. It's the armed robbery from last month. The prosecution is relying heavily on the arresting officer's testimony regarding the traffic stop." David nodded slowly, reaching into the wardrobe. He pulled out his heavy, black judicial robe. There was a weight to the fabric, a symbol of immense responsibility and power. As he slipped his arms into the sleeves, he felt the familiar, grounding sensation that came with the garment. He wasn't just David Hayes, the stranded motorist, anymore. He was the Honorable Judge David Hayes. He was the final arbiter of justice in this county. "Greg," David said softly as he fastened the collar of the robe, "have you reviewed the witness list for the suppression hearing?" "Yes, Your Honor. The primary witness for the state is a patrolman, Officer Bradley Jenkins." David's hands paused for a fraction of a second on the fabric of his robe. A profoundly cold, perfectly controlled stillness settled over him. The name echoed in his mind, bringing with it the memory of the freezing rain, the blinding flashlight, and the harsh, racist laughter on a dark road. "Officer Bradley Jenkins," David repeated, his voice dangerously soft, devoid of any visible emotion. "I see. Is there a problem, Your Honor?" Greg asked, picking up on the subtle shift in the judge's tone. "No, Greg," David said, turning around. His face was a mask of absolute judicial neutrality, but his dark eyes burned with an intense, terrifying clarity. "There is no problem at all. In fact, I am very much looking forward to hearing Officer Jenkins's testimony." Courtroom 4B was an architectural masterpiece designed to intimidate. High-vaulted ceilings, dark oak paneling, and a massive raised bench that positioned the judge to look down upon everyone else in the room. The air in the room was always thick with tension, smelling faintly of floor wax and nervous sweat. Officer Bradley Jenkins sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecutor's table. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wooden barrier, whispering confidently to the assistant district attorney, Robert Pierce. "Look, Robert," Bradley murmured, chewing a piece of gum. "I told you, the stop was clean. The suspect drifted over the yellow line twice. I lit him up, walked up to the window, and I smelled marijuana. That gave me probable cause to toss the vehicle. That's when I found the registered firearm under the passenger seat. Boom. Armed robbery suspect caught." Robert Pierce, a thin, perpetually stressed lawyer, adjusted his glasses. "I know, Brad. I read your report. But Richard Davies is going to argue that the drift over the yellow line was fabricated, and that you used the smell of marijuana as a convenient excuse for an illegal search. You have a history of aggressive stops. Davies will try to put your credibility on trial." Bradley rolled his eyes, smirking. "Let him try. I've dealt with defense attorneys like Davies 100 times. They bark loud, but they got no bite. Besides, who is the judge going to believe? a decorated police officer, or a thug with a rap sheet. Just stick to the facts, Robert warned, turning back to his files. And be respectful to the bench. We have a new judge taking over this docket today. Judge Caldwell retired last week. The new guy is supposed to be a real stickler for procedure. Don't act too cocky up there. Bradley scoffed silently. A judge was a judge. He knew how to play the game. Yes, sir, he said sarcastically, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. He scanned the courtroom, feeling entirely at ease. He belonged here. This was his territory. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench opened. Greg Robinson, the bailiff, stepped out, his voice booming across the cavernous room, silencing the low hum of chatter instantly. All rise, Greg commanded. Every person in the courtroom, attorneys, defendants, police officers, and gallery spectators, stood up in unison. The rustle of clothing and the scraping of wooden chairs echoed loudly. Bradley Jenkins stood up lazily, popping his gum, barely paying attention to the door. He was looking at a blonde woman sitting a few rows back, trying to catch her eye. "Oyez, oyez, oyez," Greg called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The Superior Court of Westbridge County is now in session. The Honorable Judge David Hayes presiding. God save the state and this honorable court. Bradley's jaw froze mid-chew. The name didn't immediately register. David Hayes. It sounded familiar, but in his line of work, he heard thousands of names. But then, as the rustling of the courtroom settled, Bradley finally turned his head to look at the bench. A tall, broad-shouldered black man, wearing a pristine, flowing black judicial robe, walked up the steps to the elevated bench. He moved with a quiet, undeniable authority, carrying a thick stack of manila folders. His silver-flecked hair caught the recessed lighting. Judge David Hayes stood behind his massive leather chair, looking out over the silent courtroom. Bradley Jenkins stopped breathing. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. His heart, previously beating with calm, steady confidence, suddenly slammed against his ribs like a panicked animal trapped in a cage. The blood roared in his ears. It was him. It was the man from the highway, the man in the rain, the man he had laughed at, mocked, and illegally ticketed just 10 hours ago. The man he had assumed was a criminal purely based on the color of his skin and the car he was driving. "Please be seated," Judge Hayes said. His voice was deep, resonant, and commanded absolute obedience. The entire courtroom sat down simultaneously, except for Bradley. Bradley remained standing, his knees locked, staring up at the bench with wide, terrified eyes. His mind was short-circuiting. The arrogant swagger, the untouchable police officer persona, it all evaporated in a millisecond, replaced by a visceral, suffocating dread. "Officer Jenkins," Judge Hayes said smoothly, his eyes locking directly onto Bradley. The judge's expression was completely blank, giving absolutely nothing away to the rest of the room. But the intense, piercing gaze spoke volumes to Bradley. "Is there a reason you are still standing?" Robert Pierce quickly reached back and yanked hard on Bradley's uniform jacket. "Sit down, Brad," he hissed urgently. Bradley practically collapsed into the wooden pew. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He couldn't look away from the bench. He saw Judge Hayes calmly open the first file on his desk, his demeanor cool and professional. He remembers, Bradley thought, panic rising in his chest like bile. He knows exactly who I am. "First matter on the docket," Judge Hayes announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "The State versus Kevin Vance. Kevin Miller. Case number 4-09. Motion to suppress evidence. Are the parties ready?" Robert Pierce stood up. "The State is ready, Your Honor." Richard Davies, a sharp-featured man in a tan suit, stood up at the defense table. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." "Very well," Judge Hayes said, folding his hands together and resting them on the raised wooden dais. "Mr. Pierce, you may call your first witness." Robert Pierce turned and gestured toward the gallery. "The state calls Officer Bradley Jenkins to the stand." Bradley felt as though his legs were made of lead. He slowly pushed himself out of the pew. The short walk from the gallery, past the wooden bar, and up to the witness stand felt like a death march. Every step echoed loudly in his own ears. The heavy leather boots that usually announced his authority now felt like they were dragging him toward an executioner's block. He stepped up into the witness box, positioned directly to the left of the judge's bench. The proximity was terrifying. Judge Hayes was only 4 feet away, looking down at him from his elevated seat. Greg Robinson approached with a worn Bible. "Raise your right hand," the bailiff instructed. Bradley raised a trembling hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Bradley croaked. His voice cracked terribly. He cleared his throat, his face flushing violently red. "I do." "Please sit and state your name for the record." Bradley sat down in the heavy leather chair. He leaned toward the microphone. "Officer Bradley Jenkins, Westbridge Police Department." "Thank you, Officer Jenkins," Robert Pierce began, stepping out from behind the prosecutor's table. "Officer, could you please tell the court where you were on the evening of October 14th? Bradley began to recite his prepared testimony. He tried to focus entirely on Robert Pierce, desperately avoiding looking to his left, trying to pretend the man in the black robe sitting inches away wasn't the same Moon he had left, stranded in the freezing rain. "I was on routine patrol, moving northbound on Elm Street," Bradley started, forcing the words out of his tight throat. He recounted the traffic stop, the alleged swerving, the approach to the vehicle. He sounded robotic, entirely lacking the confident, persuasive tone he usually commanded. "And what happened when you approached the suspect's vehicle?" Pierce asked. I asked for his license and registration," Bradley stammered slightly, "and upon receiving it, I detected the distinct odor of marijuana coming from the cabin." "Objection," Richard Davies interrupted smoothly from the defense table. "The officer's claim of smelling marijuana is entirely subjective and impossible to verify." "Overruled," Judge Hayes said calmly. "The officer is testifying to his sensory experience, which contributed to his probable cause. You may cross-examine him on the reliability of that experience shortly, Mr. Davies." "Please continue, Mr. Pierce." Bradley risked a tiny, terrified sideways glance. Judge Hayes was writing something down on a legal pad. The judge looked perfectly composed. There was no malice, no anger, no vindictive smile, just pure, terrifying professionalism. It made it so much worse. Bradley would have preferred the judge to yell at him. The icy, polite demeanor was suffocating. Pierce finished his direct examination, leaving Bradley feeling thoroughly exposed and deeply unsettled. "Your witness, Mr. Davies," Judge Hayes said, gesturing to the defense table. Richard Davies stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, a predatory gleam in his eye. He had sensed the officer's unusual nervousness, the hesitation, the utter lack of confidence. Davies smelled blood in the water. "Officer Jenkins," Davies began, leaning against the wooden railing of the jury box, "you testified that you pulled my client over because he crossed the yellow line twice. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Bradley replied tightly. "And you have a dash cam in your cruiser, do you not?" "Yes, sir. But unfortunately, your dash cam was supposedly malfunctioning that evening, correct? So we have no visual evidence of this alleged swerving." "The camera was broken," Bradley said defensively. I submitted a maintenance request the day before." "How convenient," Davies noted dryly. "So, we are forced to rely entirely on your word, your credibility, your judgment." Davies walked closer, his voice rising slightly. "Officer Jenkins, would you say you have a reliable, unbiased judgment when it comes to deciding who looks like a criminal?" Robert Pierce jumped up. "Objection. Relevancy. The officer's general judgment is not on trial here." Judge Hayes looked at Pierce, then slowly turned his heavy, piercing gaze down to Bradley Jenkins. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for a grueling 5 seconds. Bradley felt a bead of cold sweat roll down his spine. "The objection is overruled," Judge Hayes said quietly, the words dropping like stones into a still pond. "The defense is questioning the officer's credibility and his ability to establish probable cause based on visual assessment. In a case where there is no physical evidence of the traffic violation, the officer's judgment, biases, and character are precisely what is on trial." Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his steepled fingers, staring directly into Bradley's terrified eyes. "You may answer the question, Officer Jenkins. Tell us about your judgment." The silence in courtroom 4B was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on Officer Bradley Jenkins's shoulders. Every eye in the gallery, the jury box, and at the counsel tables was locked onto him. But the only gaze that mattered was the one boring into the side of his face from the elevated bench. My judgment," Bradley echoed, his voice barely a raspy whisper. He cleared his throat violently, desperate to project the booming authority he usually wielded. "My judgment is based on my training, Your Honor. 6 years on the force. I observe behaviors that indicate criminal activity." Richard Davies, the defense attorney, didn't miss a beat. He stepped away from the jury box, a man who suddenly realized he was holding a winning lottery ticket. He didn't know the history between the judge and the officer, but he could read the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from the witness box. "Behaviors," Davies repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Let's talk about those behaviors, Officer Jenkins. In your police report regarding my client, Mr. Brooks, you noted that he looked nervous and was driving a vehicle that seemed out of place for the neighborhood. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Bradley said, gripping the wooden edges of the witness stand so hard his knuckles turned white. "Mr. Brooks was driving a 2018 Honda Accord through downtown Westbridge at 8 o'clock in the evening," Davies stated flatly. "In what universe is a Honda Accord out of place in a downtown commercial district?" It was the way he was driving it," Bradley stammered, feeling the heat rising in his collar. "He was gripping the wheel tightly. He avoided eye contact when I pulled alongside him at a red light." Davies let out a short, incredulous laugh. "He avoided eye contact with a police officer, shining a spotlight into his car. I imagine most citizens would find that intimidating, officer. But let's dig deeper into this judgment of yours." Davies walked back to his table and picked up a thick, bound folder. "Let's talk about the case of William Harrison, a local business owner. Do you recall pulling Mr. Harrison over 14 months ago?" Assistant District Attorney Robert Pierce practically vaulted out of his chair. "Objection. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison has nothing to do with this armed robbery case. Counsel is attempting to drag the officer's unrelated history into a specific suppression hearing. This is a blatant character attack." Judge David Hayes turned his head slowly toward the prosecutor. His expression remained entirely impassive, a mask of pure judicial neutrality. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Hayes began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that filled the room without effort. "The state's entire argument for probable cause in this search rests on the uncorroborated sensory perception of this officer. There is no dashcam footage. There is no body cam footage. The defense has the absolute right to examine whether this officer's perceptions are historically reliable, or if they are colored by a documented pattern of bias. The objection is overruled. Bradley felt his stomach drop into his boots. Usually, judges protected the police. Usually, they gave officers the benefit of the doubt, sustaining objections to keep disciplinary records out of the courtroom. But Judge Hayes was applying the law with surgical, unforgiving precision. "Thank you, Your Honor." Davies smiled, turning back to Bradley. "Officer Jenkins, didn't you pull Mr. William Harrison over under the exact same pretext? You claimed he crossed a yellow line, your camera miraculously malfunctioned, and you claimed to smell marijuana to justify a search of his vehicle?" "I don't recall the exact details of that stop," Bradley lied, sweat beading on his forehead. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Davies countered, opening the folder. "You searched Mr. Harrison's car for 45 minutes on the side of the highway. You found nothing. No marijuana. No contraband. Mr. Harrison filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, which was quietly settled out of court by the city. Is it a coincidence, Officer Jenkins, that Mr. Harrison, like my client, Mr. Brooks, is a black man driving a nice car?" "Objection! Inflammatory!" Pierce shouted. "Sustained," Judge Hayes said calmly. "The jury is not present, but counsel will limit questions to established facts, not conjecture." Despite the sustained objection, the damage was done. The air in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Bradley felt entirely exposed. He risked a glance at Judge Hayes. The judge wasn't glaring. He was simply writing notes on his legal pad. It was the terrifying indifference of a man who knew he held absolute power over Bradley's professional life. "Let's move to the timeline of the night in question." Davies pivoted, sensing the kill. He pulled a sheet of paper from his files. "You testified today, and in your sworn report, that upon smelling marijuana, you immediately ordered my client out of the vehicle, detained him, and radioed for backup before conducting your search." "That is standard procedure." "Yes," Bradley confirmed, swallowing hard. "Standard procedure," Davies nodded. "I have here the official dispatch logs from the Westbridge Police Department for that evening." Davies handed a copy to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge, and another to the prosecutor. "Officer Jenkins, the dispatch log shows you initiated the traffic stop at 8:14 p.m. If that's what the log says. It also shows you didn't radio for backup until 8:36 p.m. That is a 22-minute gap." Davies stepped close to the witness box, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "What were you doing for 22 minutes, officer? Because my client testifies that you didn't smell anything. He testifies that you pulled him over, demanded to know whose car this really was, and when he asserted his rights, you tore his car apart out of pure spite, finding the weapon hidden under the floorboards long before you ever called it in. You conducted an illegal, warrantless search based on a bruised ego, and then you fabricated the smell of marijuana afterward to cover your tracks." "That's a lie," Bradley snapped, his temper flaring, momentarily forgetting his terror. "He's a criminal. I smelled it the second I walked up to the window." "Then why did you wait 22 minutes to call it in?" Davies roared back. "Were you hoping to find something better than weed? Were you just enjoying making a citizen stand in the cold while you ripped his property apart?" The words echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, making a citizen stand in the cold. Bradley froze. The color drained from his face all over again. The parallel was too precise. He looked at Judge Hayes. For the first time, Judge Hayes had stopped writing. The judge was looking directly at Bradley, his dark eyes unblinking, possessing a depth of cold, sharp intelligence that made Bradley want to crawl under the floorboards. I was securing the scene," Bradley stammered, his voice trembling so badly he sounded on the verge of tears. "I was running his plates." "Running plates takes 2 minutes, officer, not 22, Davies said, disgusted. He turned his back on Bradley and looked up at the bench. "Your Honor, the defense has no further questions for this witness." Assistant District Attorney Robert Pierce stood up for redirect, but his shoulders were slumped. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. He tried to ask a few rehabilitating questions, attempting to get Bradley to reaffirm his initial testimony, but Bradley was utterly broken. The swagger was gone. The arrogance had been meticulously stripped away. He gave short, hesitant, contradictory answers, terrified of committing perjury right in front of the man he had wronged just hours prior. "Nothing further," Pierce finally muttered, sitting down heavily and rubbing his temples. "Officer Jenkins, you may step down," Judge Hayes instructed. Bradley practically fled the witness box. He stumbled slightly on the wooden step, his face burning with a mixture of profound embarrassment and lingering dread. He walked back to the gallery and collapsed into the pew, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. The court will now rule on the defense's motion to suppress the evidence, namely the firearm recovered from the vehicle, Judge Hayes announced. He folded his hands atop the manila folder on his desk. The courtroom held its collective breath. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures, Judge Hayes began, his voice echoing with solemn authority. In the absence of a warrant, the burden falls entirely upon the state to prove that an exception to the warrant requirement existed. In this case, the state relies on the automobile exception, predicated on Officer Jenkins' assertion of probable cause. Judge Hayes looked down at his notes, then out across the courtroom. Probable cause cannot be a retroactive justification for a search born of bias or unfounded suspicion. It must exist prior to the intrusion. The state asks this court to rely exclusively on the credibility of Officer Jenkins to establish that probable cause, specifically his visual assessment of a traffic violation, which conveniently was not recorded, and his olfactory assessment of contraband, which was never recovered. Bradley sat in the gallery, feeling physically ill. He was watching his career evaporate, syllable by syllable. When evaluating a witness's credibility, Judge Hayes continued, his gaze drifting over the prosecution's table, the court must consider their demeanor, their consistency, and their history. Today, this court witnessed an officer whose testimony was vastly inconsistent with documented dispatch logs. We witnessed an officer who could not adequately explain a 22-minute delay during a routine traffic stop. Furthermore, the defense has successfully established a documented pattern of this officer utilizing identical, unverified pretexts to conduct prolonged searches of minority drivers. Robert Pierce closed his eyes. It was a slaughter. An officer's badge is a symbol of public trust, Judge Hayes said, his voice dropping in volume but increasing in intensity, demanding absolute silence from the room. It is not a shield behind which one can hide incompetence, nor is it a weapon to be used to harass citizens based on prejudice or personal grievance. When an officer of the law demonstrates a blatant disregard for the truth on the witness stand, the entire foundation of the justice system is compromised. Judge Hayes picked up his wooden gavel. This court finds the testimony of Officer Bradley Jenkins to be entirely devoid of credibility. Consequently, the state has failed to establish lawful probable cause for the search of the defendant's vehicle. The search violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. The motion to suppress the firearm is granted. The evidence is hereby excluded from any future proceedings. Crack. The sound of the gavel striking the sound block made Bradley flinch violently in his seat. Richard Davies let out a long breath of relief, patting his client on the shoulder. Without the gun, the armed robbery case against Mr. Brooks was functionally dead. Robert Pierce stood up slowly. Your Honor, in light of the court's ruling, the state has no choice but to enter a motion to dismiss the charges against Mr. Brooks. We cannot proceed without the suppressed evidence. Motion to dismiss is granted, Judge Hayes stated flatly. The defendant is free to go. We are adjourned until 1 o'clock. Judge Hayes stood up. The bailiff barked, "All rise." As the judge turned to walk back to his chambers, his eyes briefly locked onto Bradley Jenkins, sitting in the gallery. There was no smirk. There was no triumphant wink. There was only a look of profound, unwavering authority. A silent, devastating reminder that actions have consequences, and that true power does not need to shout in the rain to be felt. The heavy wooden door closed behind the judge. The courtroom erupted into chatter. Bradley remained frozen in his seat. His mind was racing, calculating the catastrophic fallout. Judge Hayes hadn't just thrown out a gun. By officially declaring Bradley devoid of credibility on the permanent court record, the judge had essentially enacted a death sentence on Bradley's career. In the legal world, it was known as a Brady designation. Once a judge rules on the record that a police officer is an unreliable witness or a proven liar, prosecutors are legally obligated to disclose that fact to defense attorneys in every single future case that officer is involved in. Bradley's testimony would never be trusted again. He would be useless for making arrests, useless for testifying, and a massive liability to the Westbridge Police Department. He hadn't been fired today. He hadn't been yelled at. He had been clinically, legally, and permanently neutralized. Captain Cole was going to tear him apart. Bradley slowly stood up on trembling legs. He looked at the empty bench where the black man he had humiliated the night before had just decimated his life with nothing more than the calm, objective application of the law. Karma hadn't just hit back. It had delivered a masterclass. Bradley drove back to the precinct in complete silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't activate his siren. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving behind a painfully bright, blindingly sunny afternoon that seemed to mock his internal despair. When he pushed through the double-glass doors of the Westbridge Police Department, the usual bustling energy seemed to freeze. Officer Simon Lewis looked down at his shoes. Other patrolmen suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Word traveled faster than a radio dispatch in the precinct, and the news from Courtroom 4B had already hit the floor like a shockwave. "Jenkins!" a harsh voice barked from the second-floor balcony. Captain William Cole stood there, his face an angry shade of crimson. "My office. Right now." Bradley climbed the metal stairs, his legs feeling like they were filled with wet sand. He stepped inside and closed the heavy door behind him. Captain Cole didn't offer a seat. He slammed a manila folder onto his desk with terrifying force. "I just got off the phone with District Attorney Pierce. He is livid. You didn't just lose a slam-dunk armed robbery case today, Jenkins. You lost your entire career." Bradley swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly. "Captain," the defense attorney twisted my words. The judge read you like a cheap comic book," Cole roared, leaning entirely over the desk, his veins popping against his collar. "Judge David Hayes put a finding of devoid of credibility on the permanent court record. Do you understand what that means, you absolute idiot? You are officially on the Brady list. You are a proven, documented liar in the eyes of the court. Any defense attorney in this state will tear your arrests to shreds. You can never take the witness stand again." "I can still patrol," Bradley pleaded, raw desperation leaking into his voice. "I can still make collars." Who is going to prosecute them?" Cole snapped back, disgusted. "The DA's office flatly refuses to take any cases where you are the primary arresting officer. You are a liability, a walking, talking lawsuit." Cole pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, ragged breath. "But that isn't even the most astoundingly stupid part of your day." Cole reached into the folder and pulled out a small, water-damaged piece of yellow paper. It was a carbon copy of a police citation. "I received a call from the courthouse clerk an hour ago," Cole said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "An inquiry regarding a citation issued late last night on County Road 119. A citation for obstructing a public roadway, issued to a stranded motorist with a blown tire." Bradley felt the remaining blood drain from his face. The room started to spin violently. "Did you really leave the newly appointed Superior Court judge stranded in the freezing rain without calling a tow truck?" Cole asked, utter disbelief dripping from every syllable. "Did you actually mock him, illegally ticket him, and drive away because you didn't like the look of a black man driving a luxury car?" Bradley opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was no lie left to spin. There was no bravado left to project. "Hand over your badge and your sidearm, Jenkins," Cole ordered coldly, holding out his hand. "You're on unpaid administrative leave pending a formal internal affairs investigation. But let me save you the suspense. You are done in law enforcement." 3 days later, the Westbridge Superior Courthouse was quiet. The late Friday afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the polished marble floors. Bradley Jenkins stood awkwardly near the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting grey suit. He looked 10 years older, the arrogant swagger entirely erased, replaced by the hollow, hunched posture of a defeated man. The door clicked open. Judge David Hayes emerged, dressed in a sharp navy suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. He paused when he saw the disgraced officer waiting in the corridor. "Judge Hayes," Bradley said, his voice trembling slightly. He took a hesitant step forward, nervously wringing his hands. I wanted to speak with you. To apologize." David stopped, looking at the man with a calm, profoundly unreadable expression. He did not show anger. He did not show triumph or vindictiveness. "Mr. Jenkins, I believe your union representative advised against you contacting members of the judiciary during an active internal investigation." "I don't care about the investigation," Bradley choked out, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I lost everything. My badge, my pension. My fiancée packed her bags yesterday. I know what I did on that road was wrong. I let my ego and my prejudices dictate my actions. I'm begging you. If you could just amend the court record, remove the Brady designation, I can transfer to another county. I can start over." David held his briefcase firmly, his posture perfectly straight. He looked at Bradley not as a personal rival, but as a tragic consequence of unchecked power. "I did not put you on the Brady list out of revenge, Mr. Jenkins," David said quietly, his rich baritone voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. "The justice system is completely blind to my personal grievances. I ruled on the facts presented in my courtroom. You demonstrated a clear, documented pattern of bias, illegal searches, and perjury under oath. You destroyed your own credibility long before I ever took the bench." Bradley hung his head, the terrifying realization washing over him. The judge wasn't punishing him for the rainy night. The judge had simply used the rainy night to see Bradley for exactly who he was, and then allowed the law to do its job. "Power is a privilege, Mr. Jenkins," David continued, his tone carrying the weight of absolute finality. "When you abuse it in the dark, you cannot be surprised when it is stripped away from you in the light. Goodbye. Judge David Hayes turned and walked down the marble corridor, his footsteps echoing with steady, unshakable resolve, leaving the broken man entirely alone in the silence of his own making. The story of Officer Bradley Jenkins serves as a stark, dramatic reminder that karma is rarely a mystical force. It is often just the inevitable collision of arrogance and reality. True power does not need to boast, intimidate, or humiliate others to prove its existence. When individuals use authority as a weapon of prejudice, they inherently plant the seeds of their own destruction. Judge David Hayes did not need to scream, seek personal vengeance, or break the law to find justice. He merely possessed the sharp memory of a wronged man and the quiet, devastating precision of the gavel. In real life, the most profound forms of payback do not arrive with sirens or dramatic monologues. They arrive in absolute silence, delivering consequences so absolute and undeniable that the guilty are left with nothing but the crushing weight of their own actions.